The webinar will take around 40 to 50 minutes of presentation, and at the end, you can use the opportunity to ask questions on the question box and ask all of your questions. In the meantime, please note that this webinar is on listening mode, and if you would like to interfere with us, unfortunately, we weren't able to hear you. So please use the question box at the end if you would like to ask us anything related to compliance or LEORON services. Michael, the floor is all yours, and I look forward to a successful webinar with all of these professionals attending.
Okay, fantastic, Delena. Thank you very much. Can I get a thumbs up that you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to just share my screen, ladies and gentlemen, before we get started. I think you need to give me screen sharing privileges, Delena. There we go. Show my screen. Okay. Let me see. There we go. Okay, does everybody see my PowerPoint screen here?
Yes, Michael.
Okay. And is my video blocking the PowerPoint slide, or is it just the PowerPoint that you see?
We see you, and we also see the PowerPoint.
Okay, very good. Okay, so let's just jump into it. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is a very big pleasure for me to be with all of you today. It is a virtual session today, but I look forward to being in Riyadh in the next couple of weeks to be with all of you, hopefully in person, as you all join us. Today, we are going to be speaking about compliance as a competitive advantage to relaunch our company's growth after COVID-19. Now, it's no secret that COVID has affected every single company around the world and every single person around the world. But what we're seeing is that as entire countries begin to accelerate their relaunch, as we begin to slowly but surely get back to normal, we're seeing compliance becoming an important part of that conversation more than ever before. Previously, we would see compliance as a driver of complying to rules, policies and procedures. How can we ensure that we are limiting our regulatory risk exposure, for example? Now, it's becoming part of the conversation around strategy as we move after COVID-19. So it is an absolute pleasure for me to be here with all of you to discuss that topic. Like my colleague Drena said, we are not able to give the microphone to everyone today, but please, if you have any questions, interrupt me in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go, and I will rely on Drena to please interrupt me at any time if any of our participants today have a question. Now, the standard disclaimer that I like to share, of course, nothing herein is official legal advice or any advice whatsoever, and views and opinions expressed are my own and those of LEORON, and do not reflect the views, opinions, advice, support, ideas, or recommendations of others. I like to start this webinar by asking, how long did it take to build a pyramid? Now, it might sound like a pretty weird question, but if we go back in time, thousands of years ago, if we go back to 2500 BC, we had 167 million hours of work to build the pyramids in Egypt. And we estimate that according to today's standards, it would have taken 4,000 workers. Ooh, I think we just lost full screen. There we go. 4,000 workers, 20 years of time to build the pyramids. Let's say hypothetically, they would use 261 days of work per year and 8 hours per day. Of course, we know the reality was a lot more brutal than that, but just for the sake of the argument today, it would take, just using sleds, ropes, and brute strength, about 167 million hours of work. Now, today we have different tools. We have cranes, we have vehicles, we have all of these other mechanisms that we can use to accelerate the construction of these pyramids. And if we look at it under today's standards, we are seeing it would have taken half the workers, 2,000 people, 5 years, a quarter of the time, and about 21 million hours of work. So if we take a look at how we would use vehicles, cranes, helicopters, and other tools to actually accelerate the construction of these pyramids, well, we're saving 87% of the time. Now, the question is, well, what does that have to do with compliance, right? Look, at the end of the day, if we're building a pyramid, we need better tools. If we are building a better business, at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, we still need better tools. And one of those tools to accelerate business success is becoming compliance. And we're going to see how that's the case over the session today. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing that it had the largest dramatic drop in crude oil prices in generations. And I would be willing to say, in my opinion, probably ever. If we look at the price of oil, an average barrel of crude oil around the world in 2020, we would go from about $60 or so, US of course, 60 US dollars or 70 US dollars at the beginning of 2020, down to almost 10. And in some jurisdictions, in some countries, with some oil types, we were even in negative territory. I am in Canada right now. It is a very warm minus 17 degrees Celsius. And we are an oil producing country as well, just like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the other GCC countries around the world. And we were seeing a significant drop in oil price driven by, of course, the economic shock, but also a drop in demand. People were not driving, people were not going to work, people didn't need oil. And because of that uncertainty, coupled with the uncertainty in the market dynamics, we were seeing a dramatic drop of almost 80% in that oil price. Now, luckily, oil prices have since been reversed, and we are seeing some healing in that regard. But as we look at the GCC countries, we know that there is what we call a dual shock for oil revenues. We had the drop in the price of oil, coupled with the drop in economic activity caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia was leading here, losing $261 million a day in 2020 in terms of state oil revenues, followed by Kuwait at 100 million, the United Arab Emirates at 91, Qatar at 66, and of course, Oman at 36 million US dollars per day. And as we look at these numbers, we see to ourselves, wow, if we were to have prepared better for a scenario of COVID-19, could we have better come out of this pandemic? Could we have lost less? Could we have saved more jobs? Could we have helped more businesses? And that's what we're going to look at today. And the question really becomes, could compliance have helped mitigate the economic impact of COVID-19? My opinion is yes. And the reason for that is because as we look at every business around the world, every industry rather, we're seeing 89% of companies have suffered at least a minor financial hit due to COVID-19. And if we look at business in general, we're seeing over a third of companies around the world will never reopen. In my country, for example, more than half of economic activity is driven by small business and medium-sized businesses, over a third of which are not expected to reopen. And that causes strain because, yes, from one regard, well, it should have been up to the company to plan for this kind of disaster. I don't really agree. I think it is up to the compliance function. It is up to the regulators to build a framework that companies can actually follow. And as they follow this framework, not only do they have the path to mitigate against economic uncertainty, but they also have specific targets, specific rules that they have to maintain, and regulator partnership that can actually drive this conversation forward. Now, I like to share this article here, and I've been sharing this particular slide for the last 2 years as I give these compliance discussions. And the COVID crisis did really expose what financial reformers missed. The reality is, after 2008 and 2009, the major economic recession that happened, not only in the US, but really around the world, we were seeing an accelerated movement towards increased regulation, whether that was the Basel Committee, whether that was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, whether that was other data protection laws. Several regulatory frameworks were introduced after 2008 and 2009, specifically for the purpose of mitigating that type of financial collapse in the future. But as companies were devastated with COVID, as entire economic markets were devastated with COVID, the Dow Jones losing 20–30% in a couple of days, a little bit of an exaggeration, but still a significant bear market in just a few days. We're seeing that the COVID crisis exposed what financial reformers missed. The financial reformers, the regulators, did not anticipate this level of global catastrophe when it came to economic activity with something like a pandemic. And what we're seeing is that COVID-19 is really rewriting the rules of corporate governance. One of my colleagues at LEORON, Mohammed, he mentions in his webinars that, is it really because COVID-19 was the only reason that caused this economic collapse? In our opinion, it's because we were not prepared for a scenario of COVID-19. And if we were prepared for a scenario of COVID-19, would we have had the same economic collapse? I think not. If we were to have invested 10 or 20% of the losses that we actually incurred because of COVID-19 into systems and structures, policies and procedures and compliance functions to prepare for that situation, I don't think we would have had such a strong economic hit to the market. Now, the reality is compliance is complex. There's no hiding that. Compliance is a very technical field. It's a field that is continuously evolving every single day. I get an email from different compliance organizations around the world tracking major regulatory developments, tracking major compliance developments. And during the CCP course, for example, we're going to look at how compliance has changed, not only in the Middle East, but really around the world, and how that's influencing compliance activity in the Gulf Cooperation Council region. Now, that was a really long introduction, but what are the objectives today for today's session? So one, we're going to look at how can we balance trust and business development. For those of you around the room that already work in compliance, I'm sure you must have already heard of the compliance function getting into conflict with the sales function, for example. Hey, sales function wants to grow profitability, increase customer penetration, increase volume, and the compliance is always there and seems to always say no. How come compliance is always like an internal police? We have to break down that barrier. It's not true that compliance is there to say no. Compliance is a strategic partner with business development, and we're going to see how, and we're going to see why. We're going to look at compliance as a strategic imperative. How can compliance become a strategic catalyst as companies begin accelerating their relaunch after the pandemic? And then finally, we're going to look at how can we build a compliance culture? What are the things that we need to do today, right this minute, that we can do to influence our compliance culture around the company and really promote the message that compliance is a culture, not a department? And we're going to look at all three of those things today. We're going to start with balancing trust and business development. Like we said, we have a lot of conflict sometimes between the compliance function and the business development function. How can they better work together? Well, look, COVID-19 or not, risk is here to stay. We've always had types of risk, but we're seeing a significant growth in the level of risk that we have around the spectrum. Number one, legal risk, of course. We've always had regulatory risk. These are things like fines, penalties, imprisonment. For example, Just in the last decade, the UAE and the KSA were implementing major new laws that were further restricting things like insider trading, market abuse, market manipulation, for example, and providing jail terms for compliance violations, not just fines anymore. So we're seeing a really significant push towards legal risk mitigation. Number two, financial risk. So of course we have financial risk in the past, but that's going to be here to stay. How can we manage the impact on our firm's financial performance and our share price, for example? Number three, business risk. Organizational roadblocks that may cause domino effects throughout business and throughout the supply chain. One of the clients that I was working with in the past, about 2-3 years ago or so, was actually a textile manufacturer with operations all throughout Central America and Southeast Asia. And what we were seeing is that they were developing early, before COVID, a business mitigation plan, a specific list of steps, a framework that they would follow in the event of a scenario of COVID-19. What was the result? Well, when their industry dropped 28% in profitability during the first 2 quarters of 2020, they were in the retail business, the retail as well as consumer goods business. While the industry dropped 28%, they only dropped 5%. Significant performance, much stronger relative performance for that client compared to the industry, for example. Just goes to show you, preparing for a scenario of COVID-19 will always lead to a much stronger outcome. Number 4, talent. We are seeing that we are living in a climate where top talent is incredibly hard to find and incredibly expensive. And we have to find a way that we can find, maintain, and ensure that key personnel are satisfied with their role to avoid having people leave the company, whether that's to search for new opportunities. 38% this year are searching for a new job. They are abandoning their current role in search for a new opportunity, or avoiding firms that are what I'll call riddled with scandal. If you see negative news, if our company is always in the news all the time, for example, for the wrong reasons, our employees might tend to leave, for instance, and that goes with any single industry. And of course, reputational risk. So number 5, reputation is all about earning trust, and I think that is particularly true in the Middle East. Trust is an incredibly important part of business, and if we are losing our reputation, well, COVID-19 or not, we are not going to regain the trust of our customers, our employees, and our suppliers. And we have to have compliance here to balance trust as well as growth. But the reality is that too many firms have become compliance complacent, and that has really made it much more difficult for these companies to relaunch after COVID-19. So we start, for example, at the very top, the tone at the top. Senior leaders, members of the board of directors, in the past have not taken care of setting compliance strategies for the whole firm. They leave it to the compliance professional, for example, or they'll leave it to internal audit, for instance, and they will not necessarily have an opportunity to use compliance as a strategic pillar to grow the business. That's a problem. That has to be changed. Number 2, a misalignment between compliance targets and company targets. We see over and over that business objectives often do not include sufficient compliance targets. We will see, for example, that the VP of sales or the CFO, the chief financial officer, will set a target on profitability growth, on an EBITDA margin, on an earnings per share target. All very important metrics. We have to add a compliance metric there too. We cannot only look at the dollars. We have to look at how does this compliance strategy, how has our business impacted our people, for example, our talent? How has it impacted our regulator interaction? How has it impacted our supplier relations, our customer satisfaction? And developing frameworks for all of these things is part of the compliance conversation, is part of balancing trust and business development, with compliance as an imperative there. Number 3, in my opinion, a lack of accountability. Compliance failures, in my view, are often ignored or just swept under the rug. How many times have we heard around the room when we try to raise a compliance violation and we hear, don't worry about that. This person knows what they're doing, right? Or don't worry about that. That's not your job. In my company, for example, we have a zero tolerance policy for things like that. We are, it's an incredibly strict policy where any type of non-compliance would not be tolerated. And with us, for example, even if you have a goodwill suspicion that there's a compliance violation, you are encouraged by our management team to report those violations because they believe it is important to always be above board and to never be behaving inappropriately. Number 4, my favorite, compliance is a box ticking exercise. Compliance is a chore rather than a true business partnership, and I'm sure everyone around the room has felt that. I used to be an internal auditor. About 10 or 12 years ago or so, I was working with a pharmaceutical company, and I was doing SOX testing for the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And part of that role was going and collecting samples for testing, going to interview people, doing some data analysis. And every time I would go and I would audit a particular financial report, or I would go speak to one of our sales representatives, for example, I would always get the view of, wow, here comes compliance. Okay, let's just get it over with, right? Let's just check off the box that we participated in the audit and we will be good to go. That is a problem. We cannot have that type of mentality when it comes to compliance. We have to have something more, a true business partnership. And then number 5 here, an outdated compliance mindset. Now, when I talk about compliance mindset, I mean things as simple as tools. We have obsolete tools are relied upon for guidance in the 2020s. We are seeing major international publicly traded organizations that are tracking their compliance with an Excel document, for example, or with a Word file, or with USB keys to share documents back and forth. That might have worked in the past. That's not going to work in the 2020s. We have to develop new tools. We have to develop new policies and new procedures to avoid relying on what I call artificial comfort on old tools and an obsolete compliance mindset. And the one example that I like to share here is the bonus scandal that happened with Danske Bank. And again, the big disclaimer that I say is that everything that I say in this presentation is my point of view, and all parties are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Now, in 2019, Reuters had actually come out with an article, I believe, around Danske Bank. And the scandal that was brought to light was that the bonus culture at this particular institution revealed a $220 billion US scandal. What happened was, and I'm paraphrasing here based on memory, this bank is a bank that's based in Europe, and they had a particular set of branches in Estonia, so a Baltic country in the northeast of Europe on the western border of Russia. Beautiful country. And what we saw is that there was a culture where people knew that they can go to some particular employees, let's call them, at this branch in Estonia, and in some cases even offering them gold bars to help them launder money outside of the country. And look, I have been to Estonia. It is a beautiful country. The people are awesome. These are really individual bad apples at this bank. But because of those bad apples, what we're seeing is that there was $220 billion US that was hidden and that was laundered outside of the country. And that's because trust and business development were not aligned. The bonus culture at this particular bank was around growth, 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 and not about compliance. And there was not enough of a framework in place to make compliance a priority for these particular employees. $220 billion scandal. And of course, the reputational issues and the talent acquisition issues that come as a result of this type of scandal. Now, if you don't believe these articles, just look at the data. Compliance and ethics are good for business. 88% of consumers today, according to Forbes here, will avoid doing business with a company that does not act ethically and does not help them make a difference. And that is a sea change compared to what it was in the past. If we look at even 10 years ago, this was nowhere close to 88%. If I would go around asking clients, where were we 10 years ago? We would not be close to 88%. But times are changing, and compliance and ethics need to change as a result. If we look at the Edisphere here, a 5-year ethics premium would generate about a 13.5% incremental return on your investment over 5 years. Now, what does that really mean? This graph here shows 2 lines. One in black is the large cap index. So think of your Amazon, your Google, your Apples of the world, your average fully balanced all equity portfolio with regular rebalancing. We would see that level of growth over the last 5 years, of course, notwithstanding COVID, right? Because if we look at here, this is in January, so let's ignore COVID for the purpose of this graph. And then you see this green line here, which is the 2020 ethical, right? The ethical portfolio. And this is a company that, yes, is an all equity, regularly rebalanced portfolio, no dividend, no income payments, but really just focused on regular rebalancing and all equity driven, but with portfolio companies that are more ethical in their behavior, that are not in scandals, that are good to the environment, that respect diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other important metrics that overall drive a stronger ethical guidance. And we are seeing that ethical companies outperform not only their industry, but the entire market. And in the last 5 years, that was 13.5%. So you can imagine that over the last 5 years, if we've had a CAGR in the market of, let's call it 10%, just as a rounded figure, well, we would have 13.5% more relative to that 10 because of an ethical portfolio and an ethical premium. That is a lot of money. And it just goes to show you that ethics is good for business. Now, balancing trust, balancing ethics, and business development requires a risk-based approach to compliance. So of course, that means an identification of your inherent risk, but of course, setting your risk tolerance and creating risk reduction strategies. All of that goes into the balance that needs to be part of that conversation. Evaluating residual risk and implementing a risk-based approach, and of course, monitoring and reviewing this risk-based approach over time. And these are all things that we're going to look at over our 5-day CCP course. And what we're seeing after COVID-19 is that we have to ensure that all stakeholders are up to date on compliance obligations. And realistically, let's be honest, that is no simple task. It wasn't easy before COVID-19, and it is especially not easy after. So as compliance professionals, we have to learn the lessons from COVID-19 and say, hey, how can we facilitate access to compliance? How can we engage our leaders and the board more regularly, more consistently, and more often? How can we share duties between employees and work with experts inside or outside the organization to ensure that we have the representation we need? So whether that's with engaging consultants, for example, or engaging with general counsel and outside legal teams to provide real legal advice, that can be the strong source of partnership moving forward. How can we automate incident reporting and, of course, focus on training? And I applaud all of you for being on this webinar today, because continuous improvement is the key to understanding compliance challenges and new regulations as they change over time. Now, part of balancing trust and business development in the age of COVID-19 is managing third-party risk. And what we're seeing is that, of course, we have compliance communication, but one of the things that we're seeing to balance trust with also growing our supplier relationships before and after COVID, what I like to recommend, I always like to perform compliance audits and review contract terms at my vendor facility, for example. So part of the contract that I will sign will say, okay, you are a third party, you provide your authorization, you provide your consent for my compliance team to perform a compliance audit at your location. If you don't want to, no problem, I will not do business with you, because compliance does not end at the doors of my business. It ends throughout the entire supply chain. The whole value chain is involved. Of course, you want to manage policy dissemination, focus on training, and of course, benchmarking your company's vendor management system to those of other industry players. And we're going to look at all of these things over the Certified Compliance Professional program. Now, we've taken a look at, in my opinion, that could be a 2-day course just on balancing trust and business development. But now I want to pivot into using compliance as a strategic imperative. Now, keeping compliance policies updated and improving employee training remains the top priorities for business, according to NAVEX Global Research here. If we look at asking businesses, what are your top 3 policy management challenges? Well, the first is, of course, keeping policies up to date as regulations are new and as regulations change. But the second highest priority, 40% of businesses say that training of employees on these policies is the most important, or pardon me, one of the top 3 challenges. And it just goes to show you that training is the source of, in my view, a lot of the compliance issues. We're seeing compliance failures left and right, some minor, some major. But the fundamental belief that I have is that at the core, it is because employees just don't know. I don't believe most employees have malicious intent. I don't believe that most companies are trying to cheat the system. I don't think that's the case. As we see compliance violations, I think the core of that, the cause, is that employees just don't know. And it's up to us as compliance professionals, and it's up to HR teams around the world to provide employees with that empowerment and to ensure that they're able to have that information where they need it, when they need it, and how they need it. Case in point, StaySafe says 60% of organizations saw at least one compliance failure in the last 12 months. And of the 60%, 58%, the core reason is that employees were unaware of the major rules that were impacting their immediate job function. And if you don't know the rules, right, how can you respect them? I think that's pretty clear. And the data is evident that employee training is the main cause of compliance violations in these cases. Now, where do we look at for guidance? Where do we look at to know what our compliance regulation, our compliance requirements are? Well, 2 major ways. First one that I like to look at, implicit self-regulation. So these are things like by being a member in a stock exchange, for example. If you are a member of a professional association, I am a licensed chartered professional accountant here in Canada, and by virtue of being a member in that organization, I have to follow 55 hours of training for that license. As an internal auditor, 40 hours of training. As a compliance professional, 25 hours of training. And that is audited every single year. Now, it's not a law, but by being a member in a professional association, as being a member of the Order of Chartered Professional Accountants, I am subject to these implicit self-regulation requirements here. And then we're moving into more explicit, more statutory regulation. So here we think of laws of the crown. So royal decrees in Saudi Arabia, for example, legal statutes, international standards like the ISO, the International Standards Organization, which we look at in detail as part of the CCP course. And as financial services are becoming increasingly global, regardless of the industry, what I'm seeing is that countries are diverting away from self-regulation and moving closer to statutory frameworks, to providing an opportunity for laws to be written down and clear so that people can follow them. Now, that does allow for more common standards like stronger enforcement, for example, or common regulatory frameworks like the ISO, like FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And of course, a multi-sector approach. And as countries began recovering from the Great Recession of COVID-19, regulatory improvements are starting already to address shortfalls across financial services and across other sectors, for example. Quality control. Quality control is a great example in the consumer goods industry, for example, in retail. Of course, there are best manufacturing practices, but now we're seeing stronger statutory regulation put into place to ensure quality control guidelines across sectors and across borders are respected. And the question becomes, as a compliance professional, as we accelerate after COVID-19, I want to understand what role will regulators play in financial markets. So of course, we look at things like ensuring fairness and competitiveness and completing reforms and repairing system cracks. But it's also their obligation to monitor emerging risks. And that includes things like preparing for the next COVID-19. Of course, establishing rules and enforcing those rules consistently to ensure that smaller players are not disadvantaged. Ensuring user trust. If we do not have trust in the market, we will not be able to have economic growth, COVID-19 or not. It's up to regulators to resolve disputes and, of course, protect the stability of the overall economy. And we're seeing that regulators, in my view, did not play as strong of a role as they could have to protect the overall economy at the beginning of COVID-19 and even in preparation for a scenario of COVID-19. And so I like to look at not just the regulators, but really looking at it from a compliance function and a board of directors and leadership view. So of course, the board of directors should be performing a current state assessment. How do we know we are complying with the rules and regulations applicable to our company? How do we integrate compliance around the entire organization in a consistent manner, while also adopting a holistic view? So how effective are our internal systems in holistically supervising our business compliance efforts? And we're seeing that there needs to be a stronger framework in place to prevent, detect, and mitigate around these compliance risks. And we're going to look at all of these as part of our 5-day CCP course in Riyadh next month. Now, one clear example, let's look at the UAE. 4 out of 5 organizations in the UAE faced at least one cyber attack in 2019. 75 to 80% of organizations in the UAE faced at least one cyber attack. Now, doesn't mean that every one of those caused a malicious issue, that not everyone caused a major breach, for example. But it just goes to show you that we need compliance, not just financial compliance, but data compliance, data governance, information security, information governance. All are topics we're going to look at next month. Case in point, Yahoo, for example, if we go 5 years ago, in 2017, we saw that Yahoo, every single account was hacked. 3 billion accounts were hacked during the major breach in 2013. Huge compliance violation. If we look at that today after COVID-19, they would lose all of their clients, perhaps, in my opinion, of course. Equifax. So this is something that I was unfortunately a victim of. Equifax is a major credit bureau in North America, and I believe operations around the world. And in light of the major data breach that happened, they were required to pay $650 million in a settlement. And the reason for that is because the personal information of many customers, I don't have the exact number offhand, was stolen, including my personal information. My personal information, my social insurance number, my address, huge issue, was at risk because of this particular breach, because my credit information is with this credit bureau here in Canada. And I like to quote US Deputy Attorney General Paul McNulty. If you think compliance is expensive, just try non-compliance. If you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. People always say, oh, but I don't have the resources to have a compliance function. Oh, I don't want to spend money on these compliance audits, or I don't want to spend money on these tools. I have to manage my operating expenses. If you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance, and then you can tell me. Now, with that said, how will compliance prepare organizations to relaunch after COVID-19? Well, of course, that's setting rules, so ensuring business follows rules and regulations, but it's also a closer collaboration with risk management and an effort of continuous improvement. Over time, compliance targets will become increasingly tight, and compliance functions around the world need to develop processes and procedures to help the organization thrive in that environment. And of course, all of these things need to be done in an objective fashion. And part of the 5-day CCP course, we're going to look at how we can structure the organizational function of compliance to ensure that it is independent from management while still being a strategic partner to grow the business. Now, what will the compliance function be responsible for as economies begin to restart? So of course, identification of major risks, and of course, prevention of those risks, right? Monitoring and reporting of performance of compliance. It is compliance's obligation to guide the resolution of these breaches and provide recommendations for next steps. So a lot of the work that I used to do at a previous firm was providing recommendations on how companies were able to build compliance policies and procedures, on how they can build things like KYC and AML compliance, mitigate the risk of financial crime, money laundering. How can we build a framework to help companies succeed in this environment now? But at the end of the day, global regulators will continue to see challenges. Things like regulatory deficiencies. Depending on the country we're in, we're going to see different rules, different laws. And we're going to see different penalties. In some cases, including in the Middle East, we have only monetary penalties for compliance violations. In Dubai, for example, a few years ago, executives from Dubai Islamic Bank, for example, from the old DIB, were actually sent to prison. 2 executives were sent to prison because of a compliance violation. That's different between borders. Some countries are stricter than others. Political influence. So certain cases of corruption, lack of separation between executive and judicial branches of government, for example. These are all challenges that countries around the world are facing. Resource inadequacies. Governments, regulators, police do not have the resources they need to fight these issues. And of course, all of that translates to public trust breakdown. And if market participants don't believe that the system works, if they demonstrate skepticism, it's going to lead to an exaggerated outcome of these previous challenges here. Now, what we're seeing as a result of these issues, we're seeing major updates in the GCC region even before COVID, and those are going to accelerate. From a regulatory perspective, we're seeing much more stringent KYC and AML requirements. For example, royal decrees in 2019 and 2020 in Saudi Arabia define a new framework around KYC and AML and market manipulation as well. We're seeing reviews from the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. In 2020, 2021, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, for example, both were subject to an investigation by the UN, by the MENA FATF, the Middle East North Africa Financial Action Task Force. And part of that audit looked at 40 different criteria to guide towards a favorable governance structure, a favorable compliance environment. And the UAE and the KSA passed with at least some level of compliance all 40 of those indicators from that UN framework. And that was even more than countries like the United States, for example, who only got, I believe it was 36, 39. They did not get 40 out of 40 compliance. KSA and the UAE leading the way in the GCC region for compliance. We're seeing consolidation of financial institutions throughout the GCC. For example, in the UAE, we had over 30, 40 banks. Now we're at 22, I believe, even less than that, as financial institutions begin to consolidate. And of course, digitization. So of course, deploying new technologies around the world and around the business is improving the compliance function, and it's becoming a greater demand on the part of our consumers. And we're going to see during our 5-day CCP course how that really has an influence on how we execute compliance over time. Now, some of the compliance officer responsibilities that we're going to look at during that course, things like how do we develop a compliance plan? How do we perform crisis management? And how do we collaborate with audit? Right? Compliance and audit are not mutually exclusive. They do overlap sometimes, and there needs to be a way that we can develop a relationship between those two functions to ensure that both objectives are met. Reporting to the board of directors, regulatory updates, all of these things are elements that we're going to look at as part of the responsibilities of the compliance officer as we restart our economic success. Now, one of the major things that we're going to look at as part of compliance acceleration is ISO 37301. Now, we can have a whole 5-day meeting on ISO 37301. We're not going to look at all of that today. I think even in our 5-day program, we only look at ISO 37301 for 2 or 3 hours, but it is a huge standard. We look at things like how can we gain regulator confidence and demonstrate why companies need to regularly update their understanding of the compliance environment. Risk management frameworks, encouraging a compliance culture, and having an adaptable framework to include guidance from additional recognized standards. ISO 37301 is a certifiable model on compliance management systems. In my opinion, one of the best frameworks in the world. And we're going to look at this in much more detail, how your organizations can become certified with compliance and how you can wear this certification as a badge of honor when it comes to respecting compliance obligations. Now, last topic, I do recognize it's almost 4:30 for those of you that do need to take off, really no problem. If you have any questions or concerns, of course, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and it will always be our pleasure to answer. Now, we look at compliance culture, starting with the tone at the top. And I like to look at the FIFA scandal. And there was a corruption probe that happened, and the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service in the US, the chief said, a World Cup of fraud. Right, the FIFA got a red card for compliance, and they were accused about $150 million scandal involving corruption, involving bribes, involving the allocation of countries winning a bid for the World Cup that shouldn't have won. All of these things were part of this investigation. Now, I believe it's still ongoing. I'm not entirely sure, but it just goes to show you that this is a worldwide issue that is impacting football for countries around the world. And it just goes to show you that this particular organization, according to CNN, did not have that necessary culture. Things like Volkswagen, for example, if we've heard of the emission scandal. So what happened is that Volkswagen wanted to increase their growth rates in the Californian market in the Western United States. And as part of that, the state of California has very strict rules on environmental emissions. And so for the diesel cars that were manufactured by this company here, they had installed a device to cheat the computer that was tracking their emissions. And as a result, 11 million cars had this device installed. Huge compliance violations. Now, to Volkswagen's credit, there was a significant improvement in their compliance culture, and I believe that they are acting a lot more strongly today than they were in the past. I don't want to put them down continuously, of course, but it just goes to show you that the tone at the top was not there at the time. And I like to share this comic strip here. And this just goes to show you why compliance and ethics are so closely linked. You have, for example, a boss here asking an employee, hey, have you taken the mandatory training on business ethics? And the employee says, no, but if you say I did, then you'll save some money on training, which you can spend to decorate your office. And the boss says, well, luckily I haven't taken the training myself either. And the employee responds, I hear it's mostly common sense. We always hear of compliance and ethics as being common sense. In my opinion, most people lack common sense. And the reality is we need to have frameworks in place to guide the compliance function moving forward. Now, part of our program, we look at how the board of directors, senior management, the chief compliance officer, and the compliance officers as a whole sit in the compliance function because compliance is everyone's responsibility. How can we build a compliance culture from the bottom up and all the way around? And that's one of the major things that we look at as part of our program. Now, I did want to leave you all today with some quick wins for compliance officers to strengthen the function today. So things like promoting collaboration between compliance and sales, mitigating the stigma of internal policing. Training salespeople today. Compliance changes every single day, and salespeople and other employees need to stay informed. Formalize policies for government partnerships and refuse and report inappropriate requests. Develop a policy, develop a framework to allow people to respect and just be aware of what their compliance policies and obligations are. Now, I did want to take a quick couple of moments to introduce the full CCP program. What do we actually look at in our 5-day program? Now, I offer this program myself on behalf of LEORON, and we do this in person and we do it virtually. Next month, from March 27th until April 1st, I will be with all of you in Riyadh to deliver this program myself, and I look forward to meeting you all in person. Day 1, we look at global compliance trends. So we have a greater overview of the global regulatory environment, the role of compliance within an organization, compliance framework goal standards, cross-border compliance obstacles, and common reporting standards. And we're going to look at how each of those things impact business overall. Day 2, my favorite topic, we look at financial crime. So we will look at financial crime versus fraud. We look at demystifying anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, frameworks for identifying suspicious activity, bribery, corruption, insider trading, market manipulation, and of course, trade-based money laundering. I have a lot of examples that I can bring from my previous work that are actually closely related to this, and I look forward to sharing those examples with you next month. Day 3, tone at the top and compliance culture. So Many companies have values. In my opinion, few are values-led. And we're going to look at that values-led mindset and how that changes over time. We'll look at things like corporate governance versus risk and compliance, accountability frameworks, compliance assessment, and corporate maturity. We'll look at a framework developed by the US Department of Defense to investigate military maturity that we actually use today to look at corporate maturity with the compliance lens. Day 4, we look at the office of the Chief Compliance Officer and the Chief Risk Management Officer. So we'll look at things like the organizational structure, the role of the board, compliance risk inventory, compliance monitoring program, and of course, third-party compliance frameworks throughout the supply chain. All of these things are incredibly important. Now, I am clearly speeding through all of these topics today. I only have 1 hour with all of you, but we take 5 days and we go through all of these topics in detail. We bring in real life examples, we bring in experience, we have activities, we have real life examples that we can bring in from a case study perspective to bring this content to life and to show how it's relevant for you. On day 5, for example, we look at information security risk management, GDPR, consent, cyber attacks, data sensitivity, e-commerce, all of these different things with activities every single day of the course, where you take this material and you apply it to your organization so that it's relevant for you. It's easy for me to talk about Danske Bank and Volkswagen and the World Cup. It's a lot harder for me to give you specific examples for your respective companies. So we build that together as a partnership during this 5-day CCP program. And at the end of the 5 days, you will hopefully have tools that you can then bring to your organization as part of this training. Now, again, I share my same disclaimer. Everything that I've spoken about and everything that I speak about in the training is not considered legal advice or any advice. It's really just views and opinions. My own views and opinions do not reflect the views, opinions, advice, support, ideas, or recommendations of any other organization. With that said, I want to thank everybody so much for your participation today. We sped through that in 56 minutes. I was told by Drina, keep it between 40 minutes and an hour. 56 minutes right there in the middle, but we do have some time here for questions. So I do want to see if we have any questions in the chat here. I want to thank all of you on behalf of me, on behalf of LEORON, on behalf of Drina, on behalf of our entire team. Thank you so much for participating in today's webinar. Really appreciated your participation. I hope to see you in person. I hope to meet you in person. And I hope to have all of your energy, your participation, learn from your experience, not just mine, because every time I give this program, every time I learn something new, and I look forward to sharing all of that with you over the next coming weeks and months. I'll ask Drina, do we have any questions in the chat here?
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Thank you so much for delivering this 46 minutes webinar. As for now, I don't see any questions. I see here some comments actually for the amazing delivery. So please, whoever has a question, we will be happy to respond back to you as soon as possible. So now is the time.
Fantastic. I think, look, at the end of the day, the most important thing that I want everybody to leave this program with is that compliance is a culture, not a department. And as we accelerate our relaunch after COVID-19, the more we're seeing more and more that companies need to develop this compliance culture around the entire organization, not just in the compliance function. One of the questions that we got is, some companies have the business ethics under the HR function and not under compliance. What do you think about that? Great question. Should it be under HR? Should it be under compliance? Look, I think it makes sense to have it under HR. I don't think ethics falls under compliance. I think it is a part of compliance. For example, things like a code of conduct, things like your ethics policy, for example. Because this impacts every single employee, having HR as part of that conversation, in my opinion, is a strong lever that we can pull to actually drive this compliance culture. People look to HR for guidance, for things like ethics, for employees getting onboarded, for example, as they go through the code of conduct, as they go through their ethics policy, as they go through all of the different things as part of their onboarding. Well, HR is there to guide employees and to share the message that in this company, we act ethically. And HR is the first thing that that an employee sees when they join the company. So I think it is great to have ethics under HR and then supported, reinforced by the compliance function. But sitting under HR is the standard model that I've seen, and it's the model that I personally prefer. We see another question here. Do we have another question? Let me just check. Okay. I hope that answers your question, whoever asked that. I don't see the name, but I hope that answer was helpful to you. Are there any other questions before we break for the afternoon?
What I can see, Michael, that there are no questions, but there's comments on saying it was amazing. Thank you so much. The question that previously was asked by Mr. Mohammed Kadri. So we hope that that Michael cleared your concerns about this function, the HR function. So we will be sharing with you the link of this recorded webinar, of course, and we look forward to meet you in person, hopefully soon.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Drena, for leading this webinar as well. I want to thank everybody on behalf of LEORON. I am very passionate about compliance. Some people think compliance is not super fun. I think it's super fun. I think it's always very interesting, changes every single day, and we look forward to sharing these changes with you in Riyadh next month. So have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care, be safe, be healthy, and hope to see you all very soon. Goodbye.